Sometimes it's easier to bring your workpiece to the sander instead of your sander to the workpiece. And this cool jig I made allows me to get the most out of my sand stand, and today I want to show you how I made it. I'll share with you the entire build process and just what tools and hardware you're going to need to get the job done. To make this jig, I'm using a scrap piece of particle board that I had laying around my shop. And before we get started, there's free plans in the description below that have exact dimensions if you'd like to follow along and build this for yourself. Anyways, I started by cutting all my parts down to size over at the table saw. I was able to get all the parts to make this jig out of a single 16-inch wide by 36-inch long panel. Once I had all 5 parts cut to final size, I took them over to my workbench for some layout work. To mount the SandStand to the base, I'm going to be using one of our 7/16" T-slot bits to cut a slot for some 1/4-20 hardware. But first, I need to know exactly where those slots need to be. The mounting holes on the SandStand are 9 3/4 inches apart, so I found the center on my bottom panel and then marked 4 7/8 to the left and right of that. I then made 2 marks to the left and right of those marks to see exactly where my bit needed to line up to perfectly center the head of that 1/4-20 hardware. After I double checked my layout work, I was ready to route the T-slots over at the router table. And for that, I'm using our 7/16" T-slot router bit. With my router bit height all dialed in, I grabbed a scrap piece to transfer my layout marks so I can perfectly dial in my fence position for my workpiece. Once I thought it looked good, I ran my test piece through and I found that I needed to bump my fence out just a hair to hit my layout mark. Unfortunately, my micro adjust was unavailable since my fence was so far back. So to incrementally adjust my fence, I loosened only one knob on the fence, giving me a pivot point to precisely adjust my fence into position. With that all set up, I ran my test piece through one more time and I was happy with my fence position. So I ran my actual workpiece through, cutting 2 slots that perfectly lined up with my layout marks. And the moment of truth, yes, thank goodness, the mounting hardware fits just perfectly. And while we're here, let's go over exactly what hardware I'm using. We got a 1-inch 1/4-20 hex bolt and hex nut, a 3/4-inch nylon washer, and a multi-knob mini T. To make this hardware work the way we want it to, we gotta first put this hex nut into the multi-knob. And this is a rather snug fit, so a little trick I like to do is thread the nut onto the bolt and then use a hammer to pound it into place. Then I can unthread the bolt and install my hardware. With that all finished up, we can now start working on the sliding platform. But before we build that, I'm going to first drill some holes that line up with my slots to add some hardware. I once again found center on my 16-inch wide piece and marked 4 7/8 to the left and right. I then used my pocket T-square to mark a line 2 1/4 inches in from the front edge. Where those 2 lines intersected is exactly where I can drill a hole for the mounting hardware. Now I initially only drilled a 1/4 inch hole, but I quickly found out that it'd be a little easier if my hex bolts had a little wiggle room, so I bumped the hole size up to 3/8 of an inch and found that to work better. For this hardware, I decided to go with one of our multi-knobs, and I had to use a longer 1.5 inch hex bolt as well. But just like before, I had to thread the nut into the bolt and hammer it into place to install it. Then I could push my hex bolt up through the bottom of the hole, add the nylon washer, then thread on the multi-knob and slide the hex heads into the slots. I really like using these multi-knobs wherever I can on jigs. They just make the loosening and tightening process super easy and they're comfortable to use. Next, I had to build the rest of the platform, and I just decided to do this in place using a combination of Titebond 3 and some Starbond CA glue to act as a clamp while the glue dries. Once I had the front and two sides cut to size and installed, I was able to move on to the top. In addition to the Starbond and CA glue, I decided to add a few brad nails as well to hold everything together. And right here is one of my favorite uses for my edge rule. I get to mark out center on 3/4 inch material, and this gives me a quick reference mark so I know right where to nail. With that, the jig was almost done, and I was excited to take it for a test run. So I squared up my sander to the platform and then grabbed a random can in my shop to mark a curve on some MDF. Then I rough cut it at the bandsaw and brought it back over to the sander to clean it up to my line. I am constantly making quick templates like this in the shop, so I can see myself using it for things like this a lot. To add one more element of versatility to this jig, I decided to add an additional clamping option to it, which were these T-slots on the bottom so I can clamp the jig from underneath with my track clamps. To do that, I used a bit that looks quite similar to the one we used earlier, but this one's a bit bigger. It makes a T-slot in a single pass, and it works perfectly with any track saw clamp on the market. Now, the layout of where this slot actually needed to go, it was far less critical than the first two slots that we made, since these will only be used for clamping the jig in place. And since I have a torsion box style outfeed table, I can't use this clamping option there. So I set up this temporary workstation to clamp the SandStand jig in place. And I could definitely see myself using it like this to clear up any extra room on my larger workbench. Now, if you're wondering why in the world I'd use the SandStand when I clearly have an oscillating belt sander in my shop, well, here's why. The belt sander is great for removing the bulk of material for some quick and easy rough sanding. But it leaves me with these streaky lines, and to get rid of those, I still have to use my hand sander. So I'd rather not spend my time trying to manage sanding small parts like this, and instead bringing my workpiece to the sander. This is much more convenient, and this little jig really helps maximize the full potential of the SandStand. If you already have a SandStand or plan on adding one to your shop, I highly recommend that you build this jig for it. Every piece of hardware, the tools I used, and the free plans are all listed directly below with links that will take you directly to our website if you'd like to learn more. Or if you'd like to learn more about the SandStand, I'll also link the product video below and you can check that out. Thanks so much guys for watching. I really hope you got some good inspiration out of this video, and I'll see you next time here on RedTOOL Woodshop.